The challenge of matching skills with technology. That's the topic of my conversation today with Bill Benton. He is CEO of GAINSystems. Bill, welcome.
Thanks, Bob.
What do we mean when we talk about that, about matching skills with technology? In what sense have skills not kept up with the pace and the sophistication of current technology?
Well, I think we're seeing this, and I think it is a chronic challenge. I also think it's a great opportunity. What we're seeing here is as optimization becomes more profound and multi-enterprise, as decision sciences, machine learning and AI drive a lot of the decisions, and people don't really know how. There's some branches of things like XAI, which is explicable AI, that might help, but most people frankly aren't literate in how these algorithms are deriving their recommendations. And then lastly, how do you simulate? So you'll hear people talk about things like digital twins and other methodologies for trying to try before you buy in a supply chain sense. But most practitioners aren't actually familiar with them. Mm-hmm. So, one evolution that we think is highly plausible and perhaps even probable is that rather than traditional selling of tools to people to use them that you need to train or one needs to train, is actually services being provided to the end users. So they become consumers of information and recommendations as opposed to users of particular tools.
So the analysts, the data scientists, the IT experts no longer are in the organization. They're housed within the vendor providing those services to the organization.
Precisely.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Uh-huh. And I think it's a logical corollary to cloud computing, right? As we've taken the tools out of the on-premise within firewall set and moved it up into the cloud. It's sort of also moving the usage of those tools up to a vendor that may have 100 people that are skilled in how to operate that effectively as opposed to a handful.
Well, it's a classic case of outsourcing, the only difference being that you're outsourcing something that you never really had in the first place. That you either have to acquire this talent, or you turn to someone to do it for you before you even have to do that. Is that what we're talking about here? You don't have to get the skills and then outsource them. You get them right away from somebody who's providing them to you.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. As you mentioned, the technology rate of change exceeding that which people can retrain towards is, you're right, they haven't done these things before, as opposed to taking a routine accounting task and sending that out to a third party. So
I would imagine that organizations would be a little bit reluctant to go that far, that the idea that they don't really have anyone in-house who can be trusted to analyze the data, to make sense of it, to engage in the proper levels of optimization. I don't want to say throwing it over the fence, that's probably not exactly what you're doing, but really nobody in the organization seems to be doing that. Is that a hard sell to get an organization to come to that realization that they need to look outside for this expertise?
The answer is yes, if you try to do it too fast. So, it's a bit cliche, but the think big, start small moniker I think applies here, where you perhaps pick one particular function for one subset of a company's operations and build confidence through that and work incrementally to try to deploy this type of, if you call it optimization as a service or some other type of new function where you're delivering results rather than a tool.
Yeah.
So it is, but if it's done incrementally, I think it's quite plausible.
This seems to be on the road to an end state, though, the end state being that maybe no human beings or very few human beings need to be involved in these processes whatsoever when artificial intelligence gets to the level of sophistication that it can begin to make decisions on our part as opposed to recommend decisions. So how has that changed the landscape and what we're talking about here today, a few years in the future now, when the artificial intelligence is actually performing these tasks instead of human beings?
Yeah, I referred briefly to it earlier. There's a branch of cognitive computing called XAI, which is explicable AI. And somewhat ironically, they're writing machine learning algorithms for the purpose of explaining to humans what the other machine algorithms are using as inputs.
Interesting.
And that's something that I think will become more prevalent. There's also a great book by Professor Brynjolfsson at MIT called Race Against the Machines. And this talks about how people will augment and update these models. And one of the issues that I think the industry hasn't come to grips with yet is that a machine learning algorithm has a shelf life. And these need to be constantly updated as new factors, or what are called features in machine learning, affect the model efficacy.
In what sense does it have a shelf life? Why? What happens that makes it expire, so to speak, at a certain point?
Combination primarily of two things. One is new factors or features may affect the model that didn't before. So as each machine learning data set looks over a certain time series of events. And that may not capture all of the types of events that can occur in the universe of potential influencers. So there are new events that can be significant, and then the relative significance of different events change along with things like changing weather patterns, or changing political climates, or changing tariff regulations, and all these things are in flux. And if they're outside of the test data set, when you created said model, then they need to be incorporated in these updates. And one of the trickiest bits, and what's still art more than science, is knowing how frequently you need to refresh this. The shelf life isn't stamped on it by the algorithm.
I would think the machine in some day is going to tell us itself when it feels like it's reached the point where it needs to be refreshed. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, some of that will become apparent as, say, operating performance degrades.
Yeah.
As you're using one model.
Now, again, to this issue of, you said explicable AI you're talking about?
XAI.
That seems to be an answer to the fear of the black box, the idea that the data goes in one end and the answer comes out the other, and we don't know what happened in that box to make that, to understand what that decision was. Is that indeed what it is? And also the black box exists in an outsourcing situation where if you guys make the decision and then you hand it over the fence to your client without explaining what it is, they don't know even then. So to what degree should the organization, the enterprise itself, be in the loop on how a decision and why a decision was made, whether it comes from a human in your universe or whether it comes from an AI system that made that decision?
I think that's evolving. There's probably three factors involved in that. One is shared accountability. So to the extent that the provider of this information shares in the result, good or bad. So that alleviates some of the concern about having to understand all the decisions that were made and how. As you mentioned, XAI aspires to help do this. The extent to which it will is to be determined. It's still a burgeoning part of cognitive computing, and it may not get all the way that we're hoping it does. And then I think third goes into an earlier topic, which is simulation. How can you try before you buy, if you will, by simulating these models in a digital twin? It's sort of a cliche now, but this idea that you can create an operating simulation and determine how well these would have done. And I think that's going to be an important part of, rather than trying it live, how do we simulate what it would have done over some prior period?
Well, what an interesting idea, Bill. The idea that this might answer concerns that companies have about the talent skill gap that they're experiencing as technology becomes so much more important to optimization and the like. This sounds like an interesting way to go. Thanks very much for helping us to understand, or at least the beginnings of understanding how this issue might be addressed. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, appreciate the opportunity. Great to chat.
I have been speaking with Bill Benton of GAINSystems. Thank you very much for watching.